I think identity is really important because it enables things that aren't possible right now in the current crypto landscape. And so one of those things is like compliance, right? So it's like onboarding institutions is really important. If they want to participate in this kind of global liquidity layer, they can't just do it willy nilly. They need to kind of comply with the regulatory bodies and the frameworks that they operate in. And so allowing for some form of like, KYCing and AML checks in order to allow them to participate is like super important.
Hi everyone, on today's episode, NEWFORUM's amazing guest is Chang, known as 0xJim on Twitter, co-founder of Catalyst, a cross-chain DEX for modular blockchains, former product manager at Aave, Unstoppable Domains, Ripple, and contributor of Gitcoin, among other things. We'll be discussing what a modular future and one-click blockchain looks like, as well as Catalyst's vision. So Jim, welcome to the episode, and let's start if you're ready.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me here. Appreciate the intro.
No, our pleasure. So let's go with the Modular Future 101. So what exactly is a modular future? What does it look like?
Or we could talk about what a modular future looks like. I think we have to talk about what a modular future does not look like, or I guess what have we been kind of going about for the past 10 or so years at the kind of onset of multiple blockchains post Bitcoin. And so I think like since like the inception of crypto, we've been building what are known as big blockchains. And so this is kind of a blockchain that does the job, or does like kind of a combined job for blockchains. And so depending on who you ask, there's kind of different jobs that a blockchain does. But I think in the sake of exhaustiveness, it's basically 4 different things. And so one thing is it does execution. And so that's literally kind of blockchains as we know it, right? They take some sort of inputs, they go through some sort of logic, right? They execute functions against it. And then there's an output, right? And so some people call it more formally a state transition function. And so that's kind of what we understand when we look at smart contract platforms, right? Like Ethereum, is that they're able to run applications and do a bunch of logic-based kind of actions for us. And so execution is definitely, I think, an important thing for the blockchain. And then once you kind of look underneath the hood, there's a couple other things that I'm kind of happy to go into the details of if we have time. But for the sake of brevity, they are transaction ordering. And so, how do you actually like sequence the inputs before you actually run them against these state transition functions? The second thing is data availability. And so how do you actually make the data of all these transactions or all these inputs available so that people can actually be certain that you've been running the right inputs in order to give an output and you're not lying and stealing someone's money, for example. And then the last piece is something called settlement. And this is kind of like a catch-all term, but it's basically like, how do you do block verification, right? It's like, how do you verify that the state transition function was done correctly? And again, so it's like basically just like a lot of checks and balances to make sure that no one's lying when they say that they're running a piece of code and this is the output.
And so I'll take this moment, sorry to interrupt you, and kind of take a step back. And so you were obviously describing kind of the overview of the landscape today. So looking at this landscape, what led you to really explore this modular future in terms of like why this caught your eye after a couple of years in the space? Why only now? Well, not really now, it's been a couple of years, but what suddenly was the trigger?
Yeah, I would say along with a lot of people that have been in crypto for a few years now, we've kind of been running into this issue that Vitalik kind of popularized called the scalability trilemma. And so we kind of saw during the alt L1 era of early 2021, a lot of those trade-offs were made, right? It's like, oh, you have a chain that is really, really fast, but of course it's not decentralized. And then you have vice versa, right? And so that was kind of like the inherent trade-offs that I think everyone understood very intuitively. And they're like, okay, like this is just the fact of the matter. And I think, since then, there's been kind of a popularization of this idea of modular blockchains. It's not, a new idea, but as with many good ideas, it kind of takes many years in order to solidify in people's minds. But it's actually that you don't need to sacrifices anymore, right? You don't need to make those trade-offs. And so you do that by modularizing the stack, right? So it's like all these trade-offs that you see were basically bounded by keeping all these 4 actions of a blockchain into one system. And then once you actually break it apart, you can swap it in and out. It becomes more kind of more flexible in that regard and allows us to overcome those trade-offs, right? That was something that was really exciting for me when I discovered it.
And so going back to kind of the intro, the modular future 101, in previous discussions, I think something that's very catchy probably for the audience is that according to CoinGecko and CoinMarketCap, there's about 900 blockchains today. And in the future you envision, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's going to be millions of blockchains. So could you touch on this and what exactly does a one-click blockchain, even though it's a catchy term, look like, right? If we're only at about 900 today, how do we reach millions? And then that way we can bridge with what you just said previously.
So the reason why there's been 900 blockchains, well, there's kind of 2 reasons. One is that people want it, right? Like they want blockchains that are optimized for specific things. That's why we have a Solana versus, versus like an OK coin chain versus all these things, right? They're all kind of optimized for different things and they have different jobs to be done. But the second thing is that so if people want it, like why are there only 900, I guess, is kind of like the pushback. And that's because like standing up a blockchain, especially a monolithic blockchain, is incredibly hard, right? So it's like all these different pieces that need to come together. You need to bootstrap a validator set. You need to, reconfigure a different consensus mechanism. You need to do a lot of like low level work.
You could argue that 900 is actually a lot considering all this. In fact, you should either have millions of blockchains or just a couple, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we're kind of in like a weird middle area. And so you can kind of make the argument of like, oh, like, I think we should only have like 20 or something and all the other ones should die. Or you're saying, no, like, I think we should have way more, right? Because people want it. And I think the analogy I like to make is like, saying that there's only like, should only be 20 blockchains is kind of like saying like there should only be 20 apps, right? It's like, wait, why are you using Be Real? Like we have TikTok, we have Instagram, like why are you using this, right? Or it's like, why is there a Lyft when you have an Uber, right? Like, I think those are like good analogies where it's like, okay, people want it and there's like minute differences and there's competitive dynamics and there's incentives at play in order to like actually allow them to be the case. And so in that analogy, it's like, well, we don't have 20 apps. We have millions of apps, right? And I think we're gonna have millions of blockchains kind of the same vein. Yeah. So yeah, I think we are kind of in that weird middle area and we're waiting for a lot of infrastructure to be built in order to kind of unlock that kind of like Cambrian explosion of sorts.
Right, and infrastructure to be built, and also you could argue infrastructure to disappear. In your talk at ETH Denver recently, permissionlessly connecting the modern future, you mentioned that there's obvious trade-offs, so less composability and maybe losing the current infrastructure in place. So to name only a few great projects, like the Graph or Dune Analytics or wallets. So what is your take on this? How do you think the current infrastructure will look like in the future? What will the Graph or Dune Analytics look like in this future? Do they even exist? And if yes, in what form do you see? Obviously, it's a bit controversial.
Yeah. But I don't think it's too controversial. I mean, like I personally don't think it's very controversial. But yeah, maybe others can push back on that. Maybe before. So the short answer is yes, they will exist. And so I think that's kind of the consensus take of many folks in the space as well. I think before I can talk about like what infrastructure looks like in a modular future, I kind of want to talk about why a modular kind of like blockchain thesis actually enables this proliferation of chains. And then we can talk about like what the infrastructure needed in order to kind of enable that future. And so kind of what I was alluding before, like it's really difficult to make a blockchain right now, right? There's a lot of low level work you need to do. There's a lot of overhead. And at the end of the day, like you still need to make it secure, which is, I think the popular way to do that right now is just having economic stake into the system. And there's a finite amount of money that wants to be staked, right? And so when you modularize that, you're saying, no, like we can actually have rollups, I think are kind of the popular way of scaling blockchains. And they're basically execution layers, right? They're virtual machines that execute these state transition functions like we were talking about. But the block verification actually happens in the settlement layer. And the transaction ordering happens in a shared sequencer, and the data availability is posted into something like Celestia. It becomes really, really easy and trivial to make a blockchain, right? And so the term used is like one-click blockchain. And like, we're not quite there yet, but I do think that we're trending towards that direction. There are actually a few projects that, technically have one-click blockchain experiences with a lot of kind of work around the hood. But yeah, like that's kind of like the experience you're looking for, because it's like at the end of the day, you basically just need like one server to like run all these things, and you can outsource a lot of the quote difficult pieces in terms of computational overhead to all these shared layers. And so if you make it really, really easy, like I was saying, you're kind of opening the floodgates, right? And so now all these applications can tailor all these execution layers in order to actually like have a full kind of end-to-end customization of exactly what they need. And then, they can just spin that up, right? And so that's becoming a future of like these millions of chains, kind of analogous to like why we have millions of apps right now.
So you presented the thesis, but going back to the pushback, obviously Web3 and crypto in general works a lot in narrative, even though in the background you have the devs that don't really care about the narrative and are pushing their vision, which is a great thing. You presented obviously the trade-offs. You said that we might lose composability and the infrastructure in place. Obviously, projects like the Graph and or Ceramic will still exist, but how do you see them evolving in a smaller future where everyone can do a blockchain?
There's a couple pieces unpacked there. So I think one piece is like when you look at a future of like millions of chains, like infrastructure needs to change drastically in order to kind of enable that level of scale, right? Like the structures that we have right now are very manual, and that works in future of like 5 to 20 chains, right? It's like, oh, like there's a new chain arriving. Like it takes my team probably 6 months to deploy there. Like that's fine, because a new legitimate chain only comes like once a month. And so it's like, okay, I throw 3, 4, 5 people at every 6 months, not the end of the world. But if a new chain comes up every second, every minute, right, enabled by one-click blockchain kind of infrastructure, you can't do that anymore. And so the way that I kind of outlined how infrastructure needs to change is basically along 3 principles that you mentioned. So it's like being automatic, being permissionless, and being extensible. And I think, without belaboring the point, all those 3 things basically means you are able to build a flexible structure of like your infrastructure, whether it be like a data kind of indexing structure or a RPC structure for nodes. It's built in a way in which when you add a new kind of blockchain into it, it's basically automatically read, right?
In layman's terms, if we take a step back on the issue of trust, like if you look at, for example, retail or new people coming into the space, how will they be able to understand like the concept of one-click blockchain, that if there's millions of them, like how do I trust the system behind it? What would be your explanations in layman's terms on this point?
I think like the ideal experience is like, you don't really have to educate people. You just get to the point where you're like, hey, like they're interacting with the application, and like, sure, it's like a net new blockchain, but like, it doesn't really matter like if you know it or not, right? So it's like, said differently, it's like, it's all abstracted in many ways. It's like when you're on the internet, it's like, I actually don't really know like which zone of an AWS server that I'm interacting with. And it doesn't really matter to me, right? It doesn't matter if one goes down and switches to another, because it's at the end of the day, just like, quote, the internet, right?
There's an article from Dan Elitzer from last September, and he co-founder of Nascent, and he takes the example of Uniswap as a prime candidate case study for an app chain centric future. I wanted to have your take on either Uniswap or even another project, specifically without going too much into details, but how it would look like as an app chain.
I read Dan's kind of piece. I think Nascent broadly is definitely a really good shop that it's super bullish on what they call the app chain thesis. I call it something slightly different. Yeah, I think he outlines a lot of reasons why it's really good for Uniswap to make their own chain. I think you can kind of generalize that advice into a lot of other existing application protocols that want to be their own application specific execution layer, right? And so one of the things he listed was, I think the major point he listed was just like some form of augmented economics. Because right now, like Uniswap is basically paying rent to Ethereum and the other kind of chains that are deployed on, and they don't really retain any of that, right? Whereas like if they own that whole stack holistically, any of the gas fees are being paid by users in order to do swaps, like will actually go back to Uniswap in some form, right?
And lower costs, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just the economics of it make a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, like when you have this full kind of control over the blockchain, you can also change very minute consensus level configurations. Sorry, said differently, like the economics, like broadly, is just like the main takeaway, just like become a lot stronger. It's like you take all the gas fees, you can capture MEV, right? Like maximum extractable value within the system internally, right? You're not leaking that MEV into the system where other external actors, like what we call searchers, are kind of taking advantage of that value. No, the protocol or like the team takes it, not the team, but like the DAO takes it and they can distribute it how they see fit. And so that's kind of like the main benefit of being your own app chain that Dan lists in this article. And I think there's a number of other benefits as well. But yeah, like I definitely agree with Dan. I think with many points on how it's basically a no-brainer for these application protocols to be their own chain. I do think what's holding them back is kind of a combination of two things. One thing is just innovator's dilemma, right? It's like, you already made it to an extent. So it's like, why rock the boat necessarily? And I would say broadly, when you see Uniswap as a DAO and as a protocol, it is more conservative than other protocols, right? It literally just launched on Binance Smart Chain, which came out over 2 years ago. And they were very mindful of what bridge partner they wanted to work with, right? There was kind of a big drama around who would be their provider for that. Yeah, that's been kind of their take. And quite frankly, it's worked for them, right? Like they have a premium brand. They're very deliberate about what they do. And that's kind of in a contrast to say like Sushi Swap, which was deployed on a lot of trains at day one. And, I think has like 10% of the volume is Uniswap as we see kind of that volume competition play out.
Yeah, no, for sure. So you highlighted in multiple of your articles that modularization leads to optimization. This led actually to you co-founding Catalyst. Can you explain what is Catalyst in this modular future? What are your goals and what are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, definitely. And so I think in a modular future, a lot of things kind of break because we are having kind of a very large scale of chain deployments, right? We are having a world of millions of chains. At least that's what I predict. And Catalyst is basically a liquidity layer that's built for that scale. And so it allows any chain to connect to any other chain automatically. And I'm happy to talk about kind of how that happens underneath the hood. But if you're a new kind of chain or you're a builder or an application protocol builder that wants to build a new chain, kind of the issue right now in the existing kind of tooling set is that, you deploy it and that's it, right? You can't really do anything with it out. You can't really connect to other chains. You really lose that composability. And so Catalyst is basically solving that issue for those new chain builders. And so once you launch a new chain and you use Catalyst, you can automatically connect to any other chain that you want to.
So what are the current milestones that you're aiming for? Has the project officially launched? Because you obviously have your Twitter page and website. At what stage are you in currently?
I wouldn't say we officially launched. We're definitely like not in stealth, I would say, but we haven't officially launched. But we do want to officially announce soon. And afterwards, we have our milestones. We have our white paper that we want to release. We have a test net that we want to deploy and have people kind of participate with and stress test the network. And there's kind of like an incentivization plan for it as well. And then eventually we'll be in mainnet. And then that'll be sometime in Q4 this year.
Even if the modern future is officially in a couple of years down the line, you can already start because there's still this narrative and emphasis in the space that's starting to be built right around modularity.
Yeah, I mean, there are modular chains, right? I mean, I think we're a couple of years out from like millions of chains, right, at scale, but there are modular chains already. Like Base is a really good example of one, right? Coinbase is a OP Stack fork, and there's a number of others that are kind of popping up over time.
Can you go into the specifics of how exactly Catalyst would work with an example, for example, with a user that deposits one Ethereum, or if you have any example in mind?
So for a user, basically, you kind of think of it as like a interface that you interact with that basically has every token of every chain is the net of it, right? There's no more like switching networks for different chains, or maybe one kind of bridge doesn't support a certain chain or one DEX doesn't support a certain asset, right? Like you just have everything. So it like really simplifies that kind of experience. And that's only if you're using like our UI. if you're not using our UI, like basically what happens underneath the hood is like you're just using Catalyst to interact with other chains that you may not necessarily have assets to. And so that's what's happening from a user perspective. From a developer perspective, basically when you launch a chain, you have Catalyst smart contracts that are like deployed at launch. The way that Catalyst as a protocol works is that these smart contracts are able to communicate one another, like irrespective of chain, right? And so it's kind of like a general deployment of logic that spans, different chain kind of implementations, different virtual machines, different consensus mechanisms, et cetera, and allows for communication. And so it's definitely like a really big step forward in innovation, we think, that allows for kind of this permissionless and automatic communication between chains.
So what would you consider a success then in the near future with Catalyst? Is it really launching the testnet and growing your network and partners, or are you aiming for something else?
Our kind of like high level vision is basically like the abstraction of chains, right? So it's like we want to be the underlying infrastructure that allows for that.
Right. At this current stage in time, obviously, are you the first that are building this liquidity kind of layer for a Modular future, or is there kind of other players in the space that you're in discussions with?
I think we're like the only project in the space that's asking this question and trying to solve it, right? Where the question is like, okay, like there's going to be a ton of chains in the future. How are we actually going to be able to build infrastructure, or in this case, build liquidity in order to enable that? Like, how do you have this like unified global liquidity layer that just works irrespective of what chain you're on? And so I think we're like the only project really building that.
I want to have your take now on also kind of the future of digital identity, which is obviously a big topic in the space. In terms of credentials of like obviously token gating, be it DAOs or general communities for creators, in this modular future, what place will credentials have? For example, if we imagine that a user is either anonymous or that he has like a social capital or reputation that he can port from an application to one another. So how do you see this play out? Will Catalyst just be this liquidity layer, or will you take into account kind of the digital identity aspect in the future?
I think identity is really important because it enables things that aren't possible right now in the current crypto landscape. And so one of those things is like compliance, right? So it's like onboarding institutions is really important. If they want to participate in this kind of global liquidity layer, they can't just do it willy-nilly. They need to kind of comply with the regulatory bodies and the frameworks that they operate in. And so allowing for some form of like, KYCing and AML checks in order to allow them to participate is like super important, and doing that in kind of like an extensible infrastructure, right? It's like if you have a Gnosis multisig, for example, and you're an institution, you're moving funds, like what does KYCing into a Gnosis look like? Or it's like on-ramping, right? It's like, how do you directly on-ramp into Catalyst as a global liquidity layer and not have to move funds into a centralized exchange, right? And so we're definitely trying to disintermediate centralized exchanges in that regard. The second piece is kind of like, I guess, like credentialing, so to speak. So it's like, how do you like earn credentials, digital realm, and actually have that unlock certain perks, so to speak? And so for Catalyst, it's like if you're moving a lot of volume within the platform, you kind of become like a super user. So you earn that kind of on-chain credential. And what does that afford you in terms of the kind of lowering of fees or what have you?
Yeah, we had recently on a panel, we had Evan from Disco and also Adrian from Cisco, and they were talking about the role of SBTs and credentials and how potentially in the future on a credit loan based on your digital credentials, you could have a certain advantage there.
Yeah, definitely.
You personally, right, you personally work at Lens. I want to have your take on kind of social composability and also reputation composability.
I think it's really important. I'm not going to say anything like very controversial. I think about that. Like, I think like broadly, what we're all trying to aim towards, what we're building in Web3 is basically like user self-sovereignty, or like, user is such a terrible word, but it's like the self-sovereignty of individuals. And so it's like, for me, that a lot of that has to do with like finance, right? It's like moving liquidity and having the freedom to access liquidity and interact with chains, irrespective of what chain you're on. I do think like, Evan's a close friend of mine, and her vision for Disco is very similar, but for data, right? So it's like you have your data backpack and you're able to interact with it and kind of like build kind of like programmatic kind of use cases for this data and kind of have permissions in order to, who's allowed to have that data and for what purpose. And so I think like those kind of two goals or two like journeys, so to speak, like kind of align for the same objective, which is again, like that self-sovereignty, right? And so when you look at like a multi-chain future or a proliferated future enabled by the modular blockchain stack, you need kind of these composable data primitives that kind of span chains in order to enable that, right? And so one thing, of course, is data backpacks, which I think are really interesting because they're data structures that aren't beholden to the kind of blockchain that you're building on, right? It's kind of like off-chain data that you can kind of have access to and are able to expose that into different contexts and different chains. But also, I think like key management structures are really cool, like Capsule and Lit Protocol are really interesting because it allows for kind of like that off-chain kind of key management. So like you're able to have the same wallet basically for different chains and kind of have that same user experience, irrespective of what chain you're on, which is very different than like having a different account for different chains, right?
And so actually, I want to touch on the user experience with regards to Catalyst. We mentioned earlier a little bit how the importance of educating the space. When it comes to the experience layer of Catalyst and liquidity as a kind of liquidity provider, have you started thinking about how you want to structure it in terms of how your users will interact directly with Catalyst? Like how different will it be from another AMM, for example?
It won't be that different. I think the general behavior is not something that we want to change, right? It's like you want to move value from one place to another. I think over time we want to abstract that. So it's like, why are you moving value? Moving value because you want to do an action, right? It's like you want to move it to a farm to get yield, or you want to, play a game that only exists in one blockchain or interact with an app that only exists in one blockchain. And so kind of like abstracting that step, it's like where you need to move value from one chain to another in order to do that action and just kind of bundling that together. That's something that we want to do as well. And then there's kind of like little things that we want to do in terms of the existing bridging and cross-chain liquidity experience, such as, faster finality, one-click experiences, right? So you're not doing like cross-chain token approvals. We want to shuffle it through all these different chains. And so again, the core experience stays the same, but I think there's a lot of pain points right now that we're going to alleviate from a UX perspective that I'm excited to unveil.
Can you touch briefly on what these pain points are, or are they for the moment you're keeping them hidden until you really are released to the public?
Well, like I think anyone that interacts in a cross-chain context like understands how painful of an experience it is, right? So it's like you have, sometimes one wallet, but you need to change a network, or it's two wallets. You need gas in order to receive those funds on the destination chain. You're like doing all these different token approvals. You're signing all these transactions. And at the end of the day, like you end up in a scenario where your swap actually might take like 10, 15, 20 minutes. And so you're like, okay, like I'm just going to wait here. And we're basically, compressing all of that into one seamless experience.
As we approach the end of the episode, I wanted to hear your thoughts about what inspires you currently in the space and generally speaking. Do you have any recommendation when it comes to either projects or an individual? And how do you kind of keep your mind sane? Like, what are your guilty pleasures in Web3 in general? Is it DeFi, gaming? What keeps you going, mentally speaking?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that I love infrastructure. I think infrastructure is just such a intellectually stimulating problem, and it really is where I personally think, like my people are in the space that I love interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And so I like following things that are kind of at the forefront of ZK Stark technology as a form of like scalability. I also love the cross-chain problem. I talk a lot about the cross-chain problem on Twitter. So that's definitely like kind of like a guilty pleasure of sorts.
More like a pleasure than a guilty pleasure, I would say.
Yeah,
for sure.
But well, yeah. So like those are things that like I do every day, and like I'm grateful that it's like my job and it actually adds value to my job. But I would say something that probably doesn't add value to my job necessarily that I love doing in crypto is just like, I mean, it does add value, but it's like, I just like talking to people. Like at the end of the day, like why do people stay? I mean, the technology is fascinating. The ethos is super inspiring, but it's for the people, right? You want to build your tribe. You want to interact with people that you love working with or love interacting with and partnering with. And so that's something that I love doing and spend probably a disproportionate amount of time doing.
So is there a topic that's barely explored in the space that you wish more people would tackle? Obviously, your hands are full right now, but is there something that you're like thinking, oh my God, why is nobody doing this?
I think the best example I can give is just like under collateralized lending. So it's like, or even unsecured lending. So it's like from a capital efficiency perspective, how do we build mechanisms in order to allow for that? Because or else, if you have an over collateralized lending kind of primitive, like the existing kind of lending primitives that we have in the space right now, it's not very capitally efficient, right? You're like, oh, like if I want to lend out $1 billion, I need $1.5 billion, or I need $2 billion, and like that just doesn't really work at scale. And obviously, like even the U.S. financial system has a lot of trouble with under collateralized lending and kind of what we've seen with SVB and kind of illiquidity issues. But I don't know, like I think that's something that really needs to happen in this space before anyone's going to take us seriously from a financial perspective.
No, fair enough. Thank you so much, Jim, for being part of this episode. Obviously, links for Jim and Catalyst will be in the descriptions. As for us, thank you so much for watching the episode. And yeah, thank you again, Jim, for your time.
Yeah, thank you again. Appreciate it.